Hello and welcome back to Africa FHS. Today, we will look into a sad chapter of history as we explore the role of African kings in the transatlantic slave trade. While the slave trade was largely driven by European colonial powers, it is crucial to acknowledge the complex dynamics that were involved, including the unfortunate participation of some African leaders. Let's delve into this painful history with a critical perspective. The transatlantic slave trade, which lasted from the 15th to the 19th century, saw millions of Africans forcibly taken from their homes and transported to the Americas. European powers were the primary orchestrators, but local African rulers played a part in this tragic episode, sometimes capturing and selling their people. One must understand that Africa is a vast continent with diverse cultures and societies, and not all regions were involved in the slave trade. However, in some instances, African leaders did collaborate with European slave traders. The question that has plagued the minds of many is, what reasons did the African leaders have to sell their kind into slavery? What motivations did they have from within and outside to agree to this sort of business? Let us consider a few. The first was economic motivations. Many societies in Africa with kings and hierarchical forms of government traditionally kept slaves. However, these slaves were kept to serve mainly domestic purposes. They were an indication of power and wealth, and were not used for commercial gain of any sort. However, with the presence of Europeans who were desperate to buy slaves for use in the Americas, the character of African slave ownership changed. This was mainly because the Europeans lured them with gifts in exchange for their slaves, so they began to see the economic viability of everything. Economic factors were a significant driver. Soon, the African kingdoms began engaging in the slave trade purely for economic gain as they exchanged captives for European goods such as firearms, textiles, and other valuables. Another reason was intertribal warfare. Intertribal conflicts were also exploited, and the European traders often took advantage of existing tensions to encourage warfare between African communities. In the chaos, prisoner of wars became commodities for the slave trade. The Europeans were highly involved in these intertribal conflicts that provided them with slaves, as they instigated fighting to increase the number of captives and shifted the location of disembarkation points for the trade along the West and Central African coast to follow African military conflicts. The last reason was political alliances. Some African leaders formed alliances with European powers as they saw the slave trade as a means to strengthen their positions. These alliances sometimes involved providing slaves in exchange for military support or protection. For example, African kingdoms like Mali and Dahomey initially prospered from the transatlantic slave trade, but meeting the Europeans' massive demand created intense competition. To defend themselves from slave raids, neighboring African kingdoms acquired European firearms which they bought with slaves. Thus, the transatlantic slave trade led to an arms race on the African continent which permanently altered societies and economies around the African continent. The Europeans were often more happy to make these agreements with the local kingdoms as they were always in need of slaves to work in the fields and plantations of Northern and Southern America. However, while it is crucial to recognize the involvement of some African leaders, it is equally important not to oversimplify the narrative. The majority of Africans who were enslaved had no agency in their fate. It was as a result of the brutal intersection of European imperialism, economic exploitation, and international African dynamics. The repercussions of the transatlantic slave trade are profound as they have left lasting scars on both continents and also changed the trajectory of the world forever. Today, it is essential to learn from history and work towards understanding and empathy so that all modern forms of slavery and discrimination can be eradicated. Thank you for joining us as we explore the complex history of African kings and the transatlantic slave trade. If you have found this video informative, please like, share, and subscribe. Let's continue to engage in open conversations about our shared past to build a better future. Until next time, goodbye.